One of the items I get requests to do a lot is building dioramas for 1/64 scale cars. Many collectors have dioramas to use for their collections. For example, diecast here on YouTube builds a lot of them to show off the cars in his collection. Probably the most popular diorama is the junkyard or mechanic shop diorama. Here you're looking at a very simple diorama I made for future videos where I want to show off cars in my collection. It was made to work on my rotating stand. This way I could just drop a car on the road and the whole diorama will spin, letting you see all sides of the car. I personally don't have a lot of extra space for a large scale diorama, so instead I like to make small scale dioramas so that I could fit several on a shelf. That and they're easy to store away. So I thought I would build what I call a single car diorama. In modeling I believe they're called bases. Either way, it'll be a small diorama to show off one vehicle. I'll begin by cutting out a 3.5 inch diameter disc of thin plywood bought from a hobby shop. To make this easy on myself, I'll cut it using a laser cutter, but I could also use a bandsaw or a jigsaw. Many hobby shops sell wood discs like this if you don't want to have to cut one out yourself. The wood disc will act as the sturdy backbone of the diorama that everything else will be built on top of. The wood disc is very flat. For the diorama you saw earlier, this was desirable. However, for this one, I want a little bit more variation for the ground. To achieve this, I'll cover the wood disc with some DOS paper clay. This clay is made from cellulose. As such, it will not shrink or crack as it dries. It's really easy to mold and can be softened further by adding a small amount of water and kneading it in. I found I needed to do this as my clay was a bit tough. Using some wax paper and a small rolling pin, I'll flatten out the clay to the point where it is a little bit bigger than the wooden disc. The wax paper is great to do this on as the clay doesn't want to stick to it and it makes cleanup a breeze. Once the clay is flattened out, I'll set the wooden disc on top of it and then use a clay knife to cut around the circumference of the disc. I can then remove the excess clay from the sides and put it back into the packaging to use later. At this point, the clay won't really stick to the wood all that well. To glue it on, all I need to do is to wet the wood and then apply the clay. I can then push the clay into whatever form I want. For this diorama, I'll still be going with a mostly flat surface, but not nearly as flat as the wooden disc by itself. I brought up the fact that I was going to do a video on dioramas on my Instagram, and it was requested that I subvert expectations. I believe that's the term being thrown around the interwebs these days. And do something different from a car or truck and instead do something like a tractor. This works out good for me as I just so happen to have an old Matchbox tractor I'd love to display. This is a good reason to make these dioramas. This tractor is in rough shape, but not rough enough that I would want to restore it, but too rough for my display case. However, it is perfect for this diorama as the playware will look good as I want to show the tractor off as an old piece of farm equipment left outside for years. While I wait for the clay to dry in the oven at 160 degrees for 10 minutes, I'll cut out some fence posts with my Micro-Mark Chop It. This device allows me to cut each piece of wood the same length. Of course, you don't have to use anything this fancy, but it does make this step much easier. Once I have the pieces cut, I'll drop them into a mix of steel wool and vinegar. The vinegar will dissolve the iron and form iron acetate. Iron acetate is a good wood stain that looks like aged wood once it dries. It works on pretty much all wood types and is cheap and easy to make. I'll soak the post in the solution about 4 times and allow it to dry to get the final color I want. Now that the clay is dry, I can start working on my turf. I'll be using some blended turf for this project, and to glue it on I'll be using some Mod Podge. This is poured onto the clay and then spread out. Once I feel that I have good glue coverage, I'll then dump a healthy amount of the blended turf on top of the glue and then gently tamp it down. I'll need to leave it alone for about an hour to dry enough to handle. So after that time, I'll then lift the base out and tap all the excess turf off. Odds are there will be some missing patches, so I'll reapply more glue to these areas and then add more turf to fill them in. Eventually, I'll cover the entire top of the base with the blended turf. All the excess turf can be poured back into this container and saved for later. With the turf applied, I can go ahead and build my fence. I'll start by placing the post on the ground to get an even spacing. The spacing doesn't need to be perfect as this is just a simple farm fence. After I have them spaced out, I'll use a drill to create holes for each post. Here again, I don't go for perfection. I'll allow the drill to cut the holes at slightly different angles. This will give the fence a nice aged look. Once the holes are drilled, I'll wipe away the dust and then proceed to glue in each post with some superglue. It's important here that each post face the same direction, otherwise it will be difficult to add the wire on later. The wire I'll be using is used EDM wire. EDM stands for electrode discharge machining, and the wire is a little bit bigger than the human hair. EDM wire is not something you'll probably run into, but you can also use sewing thread if you can't find a wire that you feel is in scale. The wire is cut to length and then glued to each post with a small dab of superglue. To give the diorama a little bit of contrast, I'll be gluing on some patches of greener grass or weeds. This diorama is set in the winter time, but there's usually still some greener winter weeds like dandelions growing where I live. I'll apply some more Mod Podge to the places that I want the greener patches. The real trick here is to try to be random. In fact, I find being random the hardest part of doing dioramas. In general, humans don't do random very well, and I'm no exception. Once I have the glue where I want it, I'll add on the green turf and lightly press it down. Here again, I'll need to wait about an hour to dump off the excess turf. Now I'm going to add in a tree. This will give the diorama some much needed height. I decided to just go with one tree. I would like to have two, but typically you always want to work in odd numbers up to the number 13. It's hard to explain, but your brain will find things that come in odd numbers to look more realistic, while things that come in even numbers tend to have symmetry and will look off in something like a diorama, which is supposed to be random. If you go to a florist site like 1-800-Flowers or something like that, and look at the pictures of the bouquets of flowers, almost all of them will have odd numbers of flowers in them. Yeah, I don't sleep much at night, so counting flowers is my thing. Next I want to add some grass to the ground, and to do this I'll need a static grass applicator. This is sort of one of those indispensable tools that will make your diorama look much better than if you didn't have one. They range in price. This one is about $80 and comes with an assortment of grass. You can buy a kit for $24, but you'll have to put it together using PVC if you want a cheaper version. More expensive versions cost around $180. I'll put a link to a couple below if you're interested. Getting one really all depends on how often you think you'll be making dioramas. To use the device, you load the grass into the clear container on the end. You'll then need to set your diorama on a metal surface. I'm using an aluminum plate, but a cookie sheet should work fine. The applicator has a wire with an alligator clip on one end. You hook this alligator clip to the metal plate. You can then turn the device on and shake it over the diorama. You place glue where you want the grass, and the static grass will get caught in the glue and then stand on end pointing at the applicator. As more and more grass gets deposited, the glue will fill up with grass and it will start to support itself. You can imagine how difficult this would be without this device. Once all the grass is in place, I allow the glue to set up and then turn the diorama over to collect all the loose grass to be saved and used later. Now that the grass is in place, I can go in and add some clump foliage. Ideally I would have liked to have a brown color to go with the yellow grass, but I couldn't find any at my local hobby shop and couldn't get any shipped before I needed it, so medium green will have to do. It won't look all that out of place. As I said before, there tends to be a lot of green during the winter months where I live. It's easy to apply. Drop a dab of super glue and then drop the foliage on top of the glue and then allow it to dry. Next I'll add in some extra details like these hay bales. I'm just going to make a disorderly stack of them. Then I'll use some white weathering powder and a brush to make a dusty road that the tractor will sit on. I will then use a larger brush to blend the road in. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this short tutorial on my mini diorama. I had originally planned on doing 2 in this video, but I haven't finished the other one yet. It'll be a Mad Max themed diorama, and I've added a small sneak peek at the end of this video if you want to see where I am on that project. It should be the next video out. I know a lot of you don't like me ruining this surprise, so be sure to click off the video before the 13-minute mark. Anyway, big thanks to all my Instagram friends who helped give ideas for this and my Mad Max diorama. Thanks to everyone else for watching, and I'll see you next time.